Welcome back, everyone in the room. Welcome back to everyone on Zoom. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, and I organized this workshop along with John Pollock of the Hislop Center, Jerry Singerman. I don't know why I changed your name. Jerry Singerman, who's humanities editor emeritus, Penn Press, and Peter Diamond, who is this year's Brisbane Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, and makes the whole thing run. One of the things he's doing is passing around the sign-in sheet. We ask that you put your name down just so we can have a general sense of numbers. If you haven't gotten on our email list, if you put your email down there, we will add you to the list, and you'll get just 1 or 2 emails a week alerting to you what's coming up. The other thing Peter is doing is monitoring the chat on Zoom. So those of you on Zoom, the chat will be open. You can post questions there, and Peter will raise them at the Q&A, or you can use the raise hand function, and we will ask you to unmute and ask your question live. So we opened the seminar this semester last week with a talk on the intersection of old and new media, burned scrolls, and machine learning. And we turn this week, fittingly, to a talk from our colleague Whitney Trettien, who researches and teaches at that same intersection. Whitney came to Penn in 2017, I think, and she's been a really important colleague since then, to me personally, to the English department, and definitely to this community here. And Whitney is Associate Professor of English and the Faculty Director of the Price Lab for Digital Humanities. She has a PhD in English from Duke and an MS in Comparative Media Studies from MIT. And her work has always traced the relationships among text technologies, from cuneiform to manuscript to print to e-text. Her wonderful, highly readable first book, Cut, Copy, Paste, Fragments from the History of Bookwork, uses deliberately anachronistic terms like those in the title to explore the margins of the early London book trade, showing how seemingly one-off or fringe projects like the cut and pasted Little Gidding Harmonies or the Grangerized before Granger books of Edward Benlowes can illuminate the mainstream of the book trade and can help us to theorize the history of material texts. It ranges well past the early modern period, both historically and theoretically, while being rooted in the specificity of its case studies. If you haven't read it, whatever your field, I urge you to check it out. She's published essays in PMLA, Digital Humanities Quarterly, PBSA, Shakespeare Quarterly, Post-Medieval, and elsewhere. Her essay on print-on-demand copies of digitizations of 19th century editions of Milton's Areopagitica won the Society for Textual Studies Freds and Bowers Prize for the best essay. And her essay on Little Gidding in PMLA was awarded an honorable mention for the same prize a few years later. I think they probably couldn't give it. And Cut, Copy, Paste was given honorable mention for the Richard J. Finneran Prize from the same society and was a finalist for the ACLS Open Access Book Prize. She's working on a lot right now, including a book on printing in prisons alongside a digital archive and exhibit in collaboration with Eastern State Penitentiary, which we heard about a couple of years ago from her collaborator, Damon McCool. A second major monograph in the works is on the history of computing and printing called From Type to .txt, The Origins of Literary Data, which promises to reshape the fields of book history and media archaeology. So in addition to running the Price Lab now, she's been a hugely important teacher in our undergraduate program. She's grown the English department's course on cultures of the book, which Peter Stalybras created, into a really large class that draws students from all around the university, not just humanities students, but a lot of scientists, to the Kislak Center, where she and John herd them into this room and somehow managed to get them all doing rare books work. And she regularly teaches Introduction to Digital Humanities, which is a cornerstone of the DH minor. Today's talk sounds to me like it's drawn from the new book, From Type to Text, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about Baconian quackery and text messages. So please join me in welcoming Whitney back to the workshop.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Zach, who's been a really important collaborator to me too. In fact, an essay we recently co-authored. I think some of it might show up a little bit here in how I'm thinking about things. And thank you to John and Peter for having me here. This is definitely like my home at Penn. So I feel very welcome and love being here. And attending and also presenting at the material text workshop. This is from the new project Type to Text, except it's kind of a side project that I don't think will make it into the book. And I wanted to thank the WOOF seminar, which I'm a member of this year, for reading an earlier version of this and offering some feedback on it. And I would hope to turn this into an article after this. So any feedback you can give in that vein would be most welcome. So I'm going to begin here with Dr. Orville Owen. As a young physician living in Detroit in the 1880s, he spent his days clomping about on house visits with no radio or companion to break the tedium. And so he began to memorize lines from Shakespeare's plays. And that's when, he claims, he began to notice odd passages, things not befitting Shakespeare's unrivaled reputation as a poet and dramatist. For instance, suddenly a character would mention a ship. So here's a passage from Love's Labour's Lost, and just a ship out of nowhere. Why? And what do we make of this strange phrase? A bait throw at the novum. What's up with that? He didn't know. Now, famously, there is a ship on the title page of Francis Bacon's Novum Organum. Could this be a veiled reference to Francis Bacon? Armed with this knowledge, we could call it, he returns to the passage and begins unpicking its other naughty secrets. So the pedant becomes Robert Burton, pedant because he attended Cambridge. The braggart could be none other than Christopher Marlowe, for reasons we all know. And the hedge priest is the drunken Robert Greene. We will ignore for now the fool and the boy and instead marvel at the way this single passage, which I don't even want to bother with reading because it really doesn't matter, has unlocked for Dr. Owen the key to the question of who really authored not only Shakespeare's plays, but all the works of Burton and Marlowe and Greene. That is, of course, Francis Bacon. You'll have realized by now that Dr. Owen is a Baconian, one of the many learned but mostly amateur and mostly American Shakespearean scholars who from the middle of the 19th and into the early 20th centuries believed ardently that Francis Bacon was the chief architect of Shakespeare's verse. Convinced now that these seemingly odd lines held the key to unlocking the rest of Bacon's cipher, Owen began more systematically compiling and rearranging these out-of-place passages. So he starts with a stray line from Troilus and Cressida, and it seems to offer up the instruction to, quote, begin in the middle, which he puzzles over. And he realizes that must mean the middle of the comedies, histories, and tragedies, and he goes right to the histories. And through some more clever cutting and pasting of various passages, which I'm not going to get into because it would take the remainder of my time, he ends up with a cut and paste kind of Frankenstein assemblage from different pieces of Shakespeare's plays. And it reads, "Take your knife and cut all our books asunder and set the leaves on a great firm wheel which rolls and rolls, and turning the fickle rolling wheel, throw your eyes upon fortune, that goddess blind, that stands upon a spherical stone, that turning and inconstant rolls in restless variation. Mark her the prime mover, she is our first guide." And so he went forth and constructed a great firm wheel. Taking up his knife, he cut up facsimiles of the first folio and eventually other works and pasted the leaves on this very long 2-foot wide canvas strip rolled around 2 barrels. To operate it, he would sit before the wheel on the stool, and his assistant, Elizabeth Wells Gallup, or her sister Kate Wells, would be stationed at his elbow at the typewriter. And he would turn the wheel and he would scan and mark what he called guide words. So he would look for things like fortune or nature. I'm not going to go too much into his method because it really, in some ways, doesn't matter. Bacon had told him how to do this in this letter to the decipherer. And then he would look for these guide words and around them find repeated keywords and then read aloud adjacent lines. And then his assistant would type them out. So he's conjuring and reading lines and she's typing them. And he would end up with many sheets that looked something like this. And afterwards, he would sort through the keywords, which is what you see him doing there in different colored pencils, looking for concordant word clusters in the keys, creating, as his later admirer Virginia Fellows puts it, quote, illimitable mazes of connecting sentences leading to the hidden histories and astounding revelations. To be clear, all of this is nonsense. As later commentators and codebreakers themselves, Elizabeth Friedman and William Friedman put it, Owen's method, wherein he discovers a letter to the decipherer telling him to build the wheel that deciphers it, is, quote, like picking the lock of a safe only to find inside it the key to the lock you've already picked. More, he and his assistant were obviously much freer with their cutting and pasting than they suggest that they were, which I very quickly realized when I tried to kind of piece back together that first passage about taking your knife and building a great wheel. And because his method seems so frankly silly, there's not been much scholarship on a reader like Owen or the Shakespeare authorship controversies in general. This is pretty much the sum total of it over the last 30 years, although Bill Sherman also mentions Baconianism in his excellent exhibit on early modern cryptography at the Folger circa 2015. And all of this work tends to conceive of Baconian or the related Oxfordian controversies as a battle for cultural authority, played out on the ground of the most culturally authoritative capital A author in the history of English literature. And they are that, but as I want to show you today, they're also the immediate product of this rapidly transforming media ecology. The emergence of the telegraph and especially binary telegraph code in the middle of the 19th century changed how Europeans and Americans wrote, shared, and theorized text messages. And around the same time, the advent of photolithographic facsimiles was beginning to fundamentally shift how scholars related to and studied the medieval and early modern past, leading to the emergence of bibliography as a field and as a science. So if we understand Baconians not only as quack reactionaries, but as responding to and embedded within this new media environment, we can begin to see their participation in and even their valuable contributions to enduring debates about editorial theory, bibliography, and what we might call the digitization of literary history. That is, the rise of digital means of encoding text as data. Which is to say, we might find in Dr. Owen's cipher wheel one piece of the vast puzzle of different ideas and cultural movements and media technologies that in the 19th century laid the groundwork for digital computing. So to begin to find his place in this story, we need to understand how Baconian theory began. As James Simpson has shown in Contested Will, which is like the best overview of these controversies, very thoughtful overview of these controversies, the idea that Shakespeare couldn't possibly have written his own plays began to take shape in the 1850s. Why was this? Well, for one, there was a frustrating lack of actual archival materials documenting Shakespeare's life, and those documents that had been found, for instance, a lawsuit Shakespeare had brought against a John Clayton in pursuit of £7 that he had lent him 8 years earlier, seemed to suggest a miserly moneylender who stockpiled malt. How could this country bumpkin have written the divine words of Hamlet? Around the same time, movements in philology and the so-called higher criticism were bringing into question the authorship of the Bible and challenging the existence of Homer. So in all of these readings, skeptics were finding a model for challenging the existence of Shakespeare as well. Delia Bacon, shown here, was the first person to set down a full-fledged theory of alternative authorship, not related to Francis Bacon. Born in Taljman, Ohio in 1811, Bacon was a brilliant playwright and lecturer in her own right. She was friend to and admired by some of the most celebrated literary figures of her day. But public scandal and a frustrating lack of support stymied her career as a writer, and by 1845, she had retreated into her increasingly nebulous research on the question of Shakespeare's authorship. Certain he could not have written the plays himself, she believed a shadowy coterie of men like Francis Bacon and Edmund Spenser were collectively responsible. She proposed that they hid their authorship because the plays were actually veiled criticisms of the state infused with Republican philosophy. And among her many illustrious friends who heard her expound her theories was Samuel Morse. And at that particular moment, Morse was in the midst of improving and trying to market his invention, a new kind of telegraph for transmitting text across vast distances. Now, earlier British telegraphs had relied on a really cumbersome system of many needles and many wires to encode messages, and often it was performative encoding. So the person transmitting the message would hit a couple keys, and the person on the receiving end would have to be watching the receiving telegraph to see the needles waver and then record the message. However, the power of Morse's telegraph key, one of its powers, was that its method of transmission was painfully simple. Either there's an electrical pulse that's being sent down a wire to complete a circuit, or it's not. No complicated multi-wire, multi-key, performative textual encoding, just this very simple binary system: pulse, no pulse, on, off, 1, 0. Now, the material simplicity of Morse's telegraph had to be offset by an encoding scheme, right, that takes that binary system and translates it into text, into characters, into a script. And in his earliest experiment, he used these metal slugs that were designed essentially like pieces of type, each representing a number that would then be set on a composing stick. And what you're looking at here is one of his earliest models. It wasn't like a working telegraph, it was a model, but it's totally just absolutely like suffused with print. The composing stick, which he called the composing stick, was rolled under a needle. So you would set these kind of type slugs and roll it under a needle. And the valleys and peaks of that slug would cause the circuit to either break or complete. And so on the receiving end, over here, there's a literal pencil that's being lifted or lowered to a rolling strip of paper. And so the marks that it's making in response to the type slugs will correspond to the type slugs themselves. So you can kind of match up the piece of paper afterward and kind of decode the text. So basically you're sending, like if you're sending something in English and Latin characters, you're sending it in these type slugs, which correspond to numbers. And then the marks would be decoded, create marks that would be decoded as the numbers. And then there was a dictionary that matched up the numbers to letters and words. And that has been lost, but he did use the dictionary system. When the telegraph gets to East Asia, numbers were used as a means of encoding Chinese characters. So this system persisted in East Asia for a very long time. These dictionaries proved cumbersome, though, and eventually he and his partner Alfred Vail realized that instead of encoding words as numbers, the slugs themselves could directly represent letters. And Vail reportedly visited local print shops for design inspiration, where he learned that the most frequently used characters in English, like E, were closest to the compositor in the type case. And so E becomes in Morse-Vail code a single dot. Thus, both the material instruments of the printer's work, that is the composing stick, pieces of cast metal type, paper, pencil, and the way printers organize their work within print shops are baked into the origins of the telegraph as a technology and into the binary encoding of text. And more than that, we could say that American printing gives a soft shape to how telegraphy develops as an infrastructure for transmitting text, because we're seeing a clear bias for English language character frequency encoded here right at the start. And this is something that is still being dealt with in like Unicode today, because telegraph encoding eventually becomes the digital encode. I don't have time to get into it today, but eventually becomes the digital encoding that's used to encode characters in digital media. And the exchange between printing and telegraphy, which goes way deeper than this one example, went both ways. So for instance, here you're looking at a mechanical type composing machine invented in the 1860s, where Alexander Mackie has used punched paper tape in line with the punched paper tape that were used to encode characters in some of these early telegraphs to automate the time-consuming process of setting individual pieces of type by hand. And this is a machine that works almost like an inverted Morse telegraph. So like you're taking the punched paper tape, running it through this machine, and it's plucking out the characters based on the punches on the tape. Now, to punch the tape, there was something that looked like a piano-like punching device that's now been lost. And this was part of a family of mechanical typesetting machines that were used by women. And these were actually in use. They never became like widespread adopted technology, but they were used. And many were invented. And it looks like a piano, and you would kind of play the manuscript. And as you press the key, the type would come down and you would kind of justify and set it. And they invariably show women, or sometimes boys, doing this work. And with Mackie, his innovation was that he used the piano-like device to punch the tape that would then be run in the machine. So just as Dr. Owen's female assistants transcribed Owen's ciphering, just as women would transcribe sounded telegraphic messages, here we see behind the ruse of automation and industrial efficiency is always exploited labor. Now, when Morse was inventing his electric telegraph, then he was operating within and contributing to this emerging media ecology where the indexical printing of text by the protected labor of compositors was transitioning into the binary digital encoding of text by exploited women and feminized labor across multiple industries, including print. Notably, it was only once Morse abandoned the clunky type slugs as mediating agents that he realized how that single wire telegraph could encode characters directly in a binary system of dots and dashes, signs that could be punched in paper or sounded on a Morse key. But then a new problem emerged, which you may already be imagining, namely, how would the machine or operator know when one binarily encoded character stops and another begins, right? How do you know just a single dot is an E? In actual Morse code, there's pauses between characters, but this was a problem in general for all of these systems. It can't be parsed unless the transcriber knows how much space a character takes up or how to read a space between a character. You need some kind of signal. And today this problem is known as addressing, and early computer engineers solved it by fixing the length of a piece of data. And at first, actually, these lengths were known as words. So for instance, the ENIAC machine built like just down there by about 200 plus women had a fixed word length of 10. So like you have 10 ones or zeros effectively in the encoding scheme. Now, today we don't tend to talk about words, and so we talk about bytes, which is a set unit of 8 binary bits, that is 8 ones or zeros in a row. So like Unicode, for instance, its innovation is it uses a sequence of 8 bytes that can be variable, and that's how it can encode so many different scripts, so many different languages. So for Morse, his search for an answer to this puzzle may have been what brought him to the biliteral cipher of Francis Bacon, which had been devised over 200 years earlier. So Bacon's system is simple enough. If you take any 2 types and a byte-like system for storing information sequentially, any message can be encrypted multiple times over. So like the simplest version, right, is here we have a sequence of, it's a 5-bit binary system. So each character is encoded in a sequence of 5 A's or B's, and we can simply translate that into the characters they represent. Now, it gets a little more complicated in the second level of his cipher, where he says, now imagine you take the AB binary system, and instead of encoding just the ABs directly, the sequence of ABs directly, imagine you encode the difference, that binary, either A or B, either 1 or 0, it could be anything, just the difference between these 2 things in the literal form of the text. So what you're seeing here is A could look like that first capital A, or it could look like that second capital A, right? So how I've translated that here for the slide is I've used serifed fonts and non-serif fonts. You could use italic, non-italics. You could have really, really faint, small differences in the actual letter form, right? And then that would be translated. So you have a longer text. It's 5 times as long because each A and B is being translated into a legible text. But now instead of a sequence of A's and B's, you have a text that you can read. So I could send a letter to you in this code and you wouldn't even, somebody could read it and not even know that it's a code. So that's the benefit for Bacon. Now, sometime in the 1850s, Morse told his friend Delia Bacon about Francis Bacon's bilateral or biliteral cipher, according to her biographer Vivian Hopkins. And it's this code that may have inspired and further motivated Delia's own theory that Shakespeare's plays were actually encoded works, ciphers of a sort containing hidden clues to their own origins in the polymathic Francis Bacon. Now, once Delia Bacon made this suggestion, which she herself barely followed up on, the hunt was on for the key to unlock Bacon's code. And before Dr. Owen's cipher wheel, which was kind of midway through the Baconian frenzy, the most well-known decoder was this guy, Ignatius Donnelly. His large book, which I'm going to talk about, is right there on the table. He is a delightful weirdo who probably needs more work. His works, I'm really convinced they're like the core of the History Channel's programming is like Ignatius Donnelly's works. He published on the lost civilization of Atlantis. He had his own theory that a comet had destroyed this earlier, more advanced human civilization. And then he became like one of the primary proponents of the Baconian theory of authorship. And it was after, and he goes through this in the Great Cryptogram, which I'm going to talk about here. It was after he had chanced to open a book belonging to one of my children called Every Boy's Book, and he found within it a chapter on cryptography that's talking about Bacon's cipher. And he noted directly the similarity between Bacon's cipher and the telegraphic alphabet. And he decided then to take an earnest crack at deciphering Shakespeare's plays. And the result is this massive book, The Great Cryptogram. It's over 1,000 pages, and it was released in 1888. Now, Donnelly's methods will be familiar to us already. They anticipate and probably inspired Owen's own. First, he searches for inconsistencies, puns on words that have to do with Bacon. Then he counts the differences between them, the spaces between them, and he tries really hard to look for some kind of relationship. And initially, he admits that he can't find any discernible numerical cipher or pattern. But then he realizes And he walks us through this whole process, which I also think is really interesting, that modern editions of the plays, quote, have been doctored, altered, corrected by the commenters. And in counting words, what evidence have I that the words on these pages are in anything like their original order? The change of a word, of a hyphen, would throw off the whole count. And he realizes, quote, I must get a copy of the play as it was originally published. And so he acquires a photolithographic facsimile of the first folio of 1623, the famous edition produced by Howard Staunton and published by Day and Son in 1866, the copy of which is on the table there on my right, owned and used by every major editor of the 19th century. And just like that, the cipher is unlocked for him. Keywords are counted, he's dividing things, he's multiplying and dividing again, and a consistent system seems to appear. The consistency itself proves the presence of a cipher for Donnelly, but the linchpin evidence for him, the thing that makes his theory more than just mere conjuring, is that the printing of the first folio as he encounters it in that very early innovative facsimile by necessity shows intentional design. And I'm not going to get into the weeds here because I couldn't even recount it if I tried. It's so complicated. But his entire theory hinges specifically on the purposeful layout of the pages in forms and the calculating decision of the compositors to hyphenate certain words or not. So here, typographic errors and even the first folio's notorious errors in pagination just further prove to him that a cipher has to be present, because why else would a printer leave these fairly obvious misprints in a book that's seemingly so important while correcting other minor typos? Now, of course, all of this is, as many of us in this room will know, is based on a complete misunderstanding of the early modern printing process. It seems impossible that Bacon himself would have been setting type, manipulating the book's bibliographic codes to telegraph this kind of complex numeric message from the past. But we have to remember two things. First, Donnelly is writing well before D.F. Mackenzie, well before bibliographers had a solid understanding of the procedures of any early modern print shop. In fact, the Great Cryptogram precedes Pollard's earliest work by about a decade. It's 2 decades or more before his and later Gregg's pioneering work on the Shakespearean quartos and folios, R.B. McCarro's Introduction to Bibliography for Literary Students, which is like the first real kind of textbook of bibliography, isn't published till 1927. This book was published 1888. And its description of composing and imposing is still fairly rudimentary. So if Donnelly didn't know how books were printed in the hand-press period, it's because in some ways the field didn't fully know yet, and what knowledge had been pieced together by editors was not really widely available for study as it is today. Second, and at the same time, Donnelly, and in fact, all the Baconians are writing in a moment when the increasing availability of photolithographic facsimiles made many amateur scholars feel as if they did know something about Shakespeare's material text, or they could if only they studied those facsimiles hard enough. It's worth remembering that Staunton's 1866 facsimile was perhaps the first time that many readers of Shakespeare had any kind of access to a, quote, seemingly unmediated Shakespearean text, with all the early modern spelling and capitalization and typography left unmodernized. And for a reader raised on heavily modernized editions like the Bowdlerized Family Shakespeare, the experience was really weird. In his work on early photographic experiments with Shakespeare's books, Alan Gailey has drawn our attention to several reviews of Staunton's facsimile that take special note of how strange it is to see Shakespeare unmodernized, seemingly, quote, deformed by typographical and other imperfections. That's Gailey quoting someone in the time, noting how deformed the text seems in the first folio. So it's their encounter with the startling exoticism of Shakespeare's actual material text then that spurs on the perverse analytic bibliography of these 19th century Baconians. Working in an era when old texts were newly available and new texts were turning into code, these creative book historians poured their energy into intensely and intensively close reading the material design of this fascinatingly other physical object, the first folio, in facsimile. The result looks something like this. In this large fold-out plate from the Great Cryptogram, Donnelly gives us a full-color facsimile of his Staunton facsimile, heavily marked up with his own pen marks and calculations. The meaning of the page is totally indecipherable, more Pepe Sylvia than Pollard. But that's probably the point. Through its cryptic scrawls, it tells the reader that baked into this early modern printed text are numbers that form a system, a code, and that code is tapping out a message from the past. This is early modern type as a kind of inverted Morse alphabet. a heavily marked up copy of a Staunton facsimile at SUNY Buffalo shows that this used to decode and decipher messages in the first folio in facsimile continued well into the 20th century. And the more I started looking into this, there are these kind of like marked up facsimile copies of the first folio everywhere. The irony is, even as the new photolithographic facsimiles promoted and encouraged this perverse bibliography, they are themselves utterly unreliable narrators of the first folio's history as a material text, as Paul Saltzman has shown. The Staunton facsimile is photographed from two separate copies, creating a mashup of variants that never actually coexisted across the original edition. It was also heavily doctored, as Staunton's own copy at the Folger shows. He's like in it, he's marking up errors to correct. There was another popular reduced facsimile released in 1876 with an introduction by James Hallowell Phillips, but it's a Frankenstein of an original first folio, now at the Folger, and a doctored Staunton facsimile, right? So we just have like pieces from different facsimiles and other books being kind of smashed together. And there's even some touching up, sometimes quite extreme, as Charlton Hinman has shown in a brief note that he published in 1954. So even the erroneous page numbers, which are the source of so much Baconian speculation, have been corrected in many of these facsimiles. So of course, like thinking, why would a facsimile be corrected is kind of an interesting thing. And then what does it mean about the originality, authenticity of the text as is being kind of telegraphed in the Baconians is kind of interesting to think with here. So Donnelly may have known that the Staunton was unreliable. In fact, I think it's quite funny. So he includes in this book 32 full, like he photographs a first folio at Columbia and includes 32 pages of it in his great cryptogram, almost like an inspiration for others to like find the code, which I think is really cool and also quite like inventive or experimental of the publisher in some ways, quite risky of the publisher, maybe I want to say. But these are not copied from the Staunton facsimile, but from a first folio at Columbia. And just in case you worry that it's not real, he includes another photographic facsimile of a handwritten note by Melville Dewey, who was at the time, the chief librarian of Columbia. And he's like obsessively asserting that these pages have been exactly reproduced from the perfect and authentic copy of the great Shakespeare folio, having been photographed under the personal supervision of a library officer, right? So he's really trying to authenticate this thing, and then he includes it in the book itself. So while it would be easy to dismiss Donnelly as an eccentric maniac, his book itself offers us an important late 19th century experiment in new media, both in how it's engaging with telegraphic encoding as a means of trying to close read a set of texts, but also in how the book itself is mediating the first folio for, and in a sense, trying to create an audience of amateur bibliographers. It was actually, though, neither Donnelly nor Owen, but in fact, Dr. Owen's original assistant, Elizabeth Wells Gallup, who would take this perverse bibliography to its furthest extremes. Having studied Bacon's original biliteral cipher, this one, Gallup came to believe that the first folio was not encoded in numbers or the layout of the pages or anything that had been considered so far, but in the actual material design of the typeface. So remember in Bacon's this biliteral cipher, he writes it as biliteral, but it shows up in the literature as bilateral cipher sometimes. But in the cipher, any text could mean any other text. So as long as there's some distinguishing feature in the type itself, that you can map onto this original binary code. So Gallup became really convinced that slight differences in the typeface were the key. And so she starts tracing characters. She definitely worked with the Staunton facsimile because in her library, which is at the New York Public Library now, she had a copy, and she also had a copy of the James Hallowell Phillips reduced facsimile. She had a type facsimile, which you're seeing here. And actually, that's a newspaper article about Donnelly's great cryptogram kind of pasted into the front of this book. So it's a network of people engaging with this work. Later, after the eccentric millionaire George Fabian, which is a whole other piece of the story, began supporting her work at Riverbank Laboratories, she would have photographs taken. Well, actually, before I get to that, let me explain this. So this is actually a page. What you're looking at here is the bottom right is the Hallowell Phillips facsimile. And in her copy, she goes through and has like all these little obsessive tick marks. And what she's doing is trying to decode which characters were slightly different from the other characters and like come up with a system. And that's what her entire theory was based on. So after Fabian starts supporting her work, she later would have photographs taken from the first folios at the Newberry. They were blown up and printed. And her library and her materials is now at the New York Public Library. And I went there really ambitiously thinking I would like, oh, I'll look at like a couple boxes in a day or whatever. But it's like 28 boxes just stuffed, like basically more or less uncatalogued, just like stuffed with notes and notes and notes and notes and notes of her work on this stuff. And she herself had put them into some kind of order, which is also fascinating because she was working with Orville Owen's notes as well, which is where I have those from. They're all in her materials, just dozens of dusty boxes. But eventually she would go to England. She went on a research trip. This was like her life's work. And these multiple tracings that you see here would yield dozens of portfolios of charts that reveal her tracking the bilateral cipher across not only Shakespeare's plays, but like every canonical work of early modern printed literature. And it's worth noting she's not the only woman engaged in this material text analysis. There's like a 5-hour version of this talk that goes through many others. Elizabeth Debold has shown in her research on Folger First Folio 33 that Constance Pott was 2 decades earlier engaged in comparing Folio 33 to the facsimile and in the efforts of like proving that Bacon was the author of Shakespeare's works. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested. Back to Gallup though. So even as Gallup was studying the folio's material text in this kind of high-res photographic detail, she was also transcribing the text as these plain text, usually typewritten and divided into groups of 5 kind of texts because it's a 5-bit binary system. And these typewritten mediations helped her extract the ciphered text from the surface layer of typographic differences in the photographs. And like Donnelly and Delia Bacon before her, she understood this process of ciphering specifically in relation to the telegraph as a technology of linguistic hegemony. In a random letter in her papers to essayist Charles Dudley Warner, she had her attorney ask for advice about what she should do with this vast evidence that she was excavating of Bacon's authorship. And he writes, quote, "You are doubtless aware that the signal codes of most civilized nations and the majority of telegraph alphabets are adaptations of the omnia per omnia cipher code invented by Francis Bacon. Applying this code in its simplicity, there has been deciphered from the original editions of Shakespeare and Anatomy of Melancholy some surprising matter." So even as the telegraph is creating this kind of new media environment in which the authorship controversies are like flourishing, the authorship controversies in turn are giving that new technology, entangled as it is with this colonial enterprise, a kind of Anglo-centric cultural authority that's deeply rooting that authority in Shakespeare's time and text. It's Gallup's treatment of the material text as this series of layers, or what Dennis Tenen would later call laminates, that so curiously reflects what digital text actually is today. On the one hand, a materially specific visual image, a glyph made up of pixels or vectors with specific coordinates. On the other hand, telegraphically encodable plain text, lacking the specificity of any particular formatting. To the Baconians developing this paradigm, their approach to reading the first folio wasn't just some convenient application of telegraphic principles, but instead constituted a full-blown theory of close reading materiality, one with deep consequences for how early modern books should be edited in the future. In a letter to the preeminent Shakespearean of his day and editor of the New Variorum, Horace Howard Furness, Gallup's mentor, Owen, argued that the presence of a cipher in the first folio shows that that book, that Shakespeare himself, should no longer be subject to the kind of scholarly editing that he had been from Pope onward, but especially in the wake of Edward Malone. And he writes, quote, "One so familiar with Shakespeare will, I trust, find the lines of the plays not less interesting in their new setting," meaning in the books that he's sharing, the new Baconian cipher, "and a new and true meaning in many lines which have been, quote, edited into meanings which the text does not warrant or bear out. The discovery and application of the cipher show that the 1623 folio edition should stand in its integrity, and the irrelevant and strange combinations were placed as they are found in the plays for a hidden purpose to be deciphered, not edited, into forms to be readily understood in telling the hidden story." Like, note that he's putting edited here in scare quotes, while Owen, after writing this letter, or possibly Furness, incredulously after reading it, underlined deciphered, right? So deciphered versus editing. Deciphered requires that kind of unmediated access to the original book, that photography was thought to bring, as Gailey has pointed out in his work, as opposed to the encrusted text of something like Furness's Variorum edition that's kind of cluttered with lots of other words and thoughts. In Owen's letter, we might find echoes of the late 20th century movement to unedit the Renaissance. The notion of unediting became prominent in the 1990s, in part through Randall McLeod's essays, urging scholars to return to and read the early modern material text as a string of mediations, each version making an equal contribution to the text's meaning. It became entrenched in the field after Leah Marcus's influential 1996 book, Unediting the Renaissance, which argued, in language that echoes Owen's above, that, quote, Shakespeare's first folio should not be viewed as mutilated copies of originals, but rather reputable alternatives encoding differences in ideology, cultural meaning, and other elements of performance. The unediting movement cleared a path for book historians to close read the materiality of a book with increasingly little regard for the text itself, reading misprints and typos as ciphers of early modern printing processes. It also provided much of the theoretical grounding for many digital editions where you just access an image alone. Of course, ultimately, Owen's ciphering is mere conjuring, whereas scholars like McLeod and Marcus constructed their arguments with brilliant nuance, with actual historical and textual evidence. They show, in a way that Owen never does, the literary, critical, and historical payoff of close reading a material text. Yet we might still see the Baconians as the disowned forebears of book history as it is practiced today. Like them, we operate in a space where photographic reproductions are provoking novel ways of looking, ways that both reveal new readings of a text and deceive us. There is in Owen's cipher wheel something of a cautionary tale for computational humanities too, where there continues to be a certain allure in the idea that if we can just mechanize the method of textual analysis, a text's secrets will be unlocked for us. Of course, all of this hinges on willfully ignoring the feminized, racialized labor behind the machine's ostensible automation, whether it's Elizabeth Gallup or Kate Wells sitting before the cipher wheel, typing out words as Owen pronounces them, or if it's an anonymous South Asian reader keying in without attribution the plain text transcription that now makes Ebo's images searchable. To ensure that we are not merely conjuring facts from facsimile, we might develop and, more importantly, teach as part of our methods a more robust theory of reprographics and a deeper understanding of the data structures that underpin and give literal shape to our work. Because how we mediate the text we study, by what technologies and through what infrastructures, determines softly how we decipher the codes they contain. Which is to say, we shun these Baconian forebears, so many of whom were women working in a man's world of Shakespearean editing, at our peril. Now, for all the strangeness and frankly inaccuracy of her deciphering, Gallup would go on to work at George Fabian's Riverbank Laboratories, where she trained this young woman, Elizabeth Friedman, to help her and Kate decipher early modern texts. Elizabeth Friedman came to realize Gallup's theories about Shakespeare's authorship were totally wrong, and she even co-wrote an award-winning book criticizing her methods in the 1950s. But she did take the lessons that she learned about Baconian ciphering with her into her career as a cryptanalyst cracking enemy codes for the US government during both world wars. Her and her husband wrote like the first book on cryptography, and her contributions were absolutely foundational, helping catalyze the emergence of mainframe computing in the 1940s and 1950s. While the Baconian women's work helped lay the foundations for the emergence of computing, Gallup's mentor, Dr. Owen, has suffered a less illustrious fate. After his death, his cipher wheel ended up in a warehouse, rejected even by the Detroit Public Library, which thought it should be placed in an institution better prepared to carry on its research, which in some odd way it is today. It's at the Summit University in Lighthouse. This is an apocalyptic cult operating out of an enormous ranch in Montana. It runs a side hustle in online classes in theosophy, chakras, and the mystic count of Saint Germain. They predicted the end times in 1990. It never came to pass, but they still have an enormous shelter stocked with canned goods. A Baconian and admirer of Dr. Owen's work found the wheel and bequeathed it to this cult after she died, where it seems to remain today, presumably collecting dust in a garage. I wouldn't know because I cannot get anyone there to pick up the phone or answer my emails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Questions are open. Lillian?
Thank you so much, Whitney. Listening to you, I thought I could name it the cryptographic uncanny. because trying to find the uncanny is something that we are not familiar with. And the canny is something we are familiar with, and came to the conclusion they are the same.
Mm.
And in your description of coding, there are two very different directions. One is the coding of Samuel Morse, where you know what you are coding, and the coding exists to transport a text. So it's not to encrypt for secrecy, and it's not to do anything with it other than transport it and get it to another person. Now, the other code is to make things secret, to make things illegible. And the wonderful thing that you have shown is to make illegible, or to insist that it's always legible, just out transporting, turns out to be the same. And so I wonder what this dual canny uncanny is doing for our understanding of coding.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really interesting question and thoughts. I mean, I was really careful because I belatedly realized I was kind of using cipher and code, or ciphering or encoding in the same like exchangeably, and they aren't in cryptography. And so I was trying to be really careful about like ciphering and coding. But what I think this story, for me, why it's so interesting as somebody who's actually more interested in the digital media side than in some of the 19th century stuff, is that, you know, there's been a lot of work. I mean, we were talking today about Wendy Chun and kind of source code and sorcery. There's been a lot of work in new media about the kind of strangeness of code, code as ideology, code as a way, as like a vector of control today, right? That in some ways is counter to how code is taught in computer science, which is as a utilitarian tool. Like, you're right, it's like the transmission of text. It's a means of doing something. You write a function and something happens, right? And there is no politics to it. And it's like a fight on some of the listservs every once in a while, right? Is there like a politics to code or not? But I think that if looking at the Baconians and the ciphering and cryptography's kind of collaboration at this originary moment helps us understand the deep history of actually how ideological, political, whatever code is, right? It's never a neutral thing. It's being created in an environment in which there are conversations with Baconians happening between Morse and Baconians, right? And so yeah, thinking about exactly how that kind of telegraphic encoding comes together with something we've dismissed as like pure quackery is definitely like part of what I'm interested in. Thank you. Yes. I don't know if you're doing questions or.
So thank you for this. This is amazing. I realized the Great Cryptogram. I was like, I've seen this book before. Actually, there was a copy of it in this cult archives that I used to work in Florida. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about the kind of differences or the establishment of like scholarship versus a cult, or, you know, this kind of spiritualist knowledge that's so popular in this, like, you know, 19th century period. So just, you know, you had mentioned that these early people didn't have access to some of the scholarship that we have now that explains better the early modern printing process. So if you could just talk about the kind of formulation of those two kind of distinct like aspects of scholarship.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think that could answer this better, but my sense is that today Shakespeareans more or less don't deal with any of the Baconian, Oxfordian controversies, in part because it's like it has this kind of taint of like association with cults, and it's kind of it's not real scholarship, and so it's a desire to distance ourselves from it. But in reading some of the stuff from the late 19th century, it wasn't that. That's part of what I think is so interesting. Donnelly is his own brand, who's like spinning off in all these different ways and promoting all kinds of theories to a moment that was like our own, very susceptible to various kinds of conspiracy theories. But all the other people, like Elizabeth Wells Gallup, she was a really serious person. She was a serious scholar. She saved all her papers. She kept them in portfolios. She was thoroughly convinced by the cipher, and so convinced that she was finding what she wanted to find in the materials. And her work, although it's not like several examples of some of her acolytes are on the table there, while it's not like cited at all in scholarship today, had a huge influence among the Baconians and among people who went on and did things that are not seen as crazy at all, like Elizabeth Friedman and the Friedmans and the code crackers in World War I. So the kind of cultishness of it to me is a more modern thing. Like the fact that it's at Summit University today is like thoroughly indicative of how the Baconians are like conceived of in the field today. But I don't think that that was the case in the 19th century. So I'm always kind of like interested in trying to unpick that earlier moment and see like, well, what were they actually thinking with? They weren't thinking in cultish spiritualist way. There was a lot of spiritualism happening in the 19th century, especially with medium. They could have easily been in that vein, but they weren't. They were doing very serious material text analysis, that they were taking notes. They were doing it collaboratively. They were sharing notes with each other. They were flying across the Atlantic Ocean, or I guess taking a boat for in earlier cases across the Atlantic Ocean, like going to look at original materials. They had funding from the major like technocrat of the day, George Fabian, who ran what has been compared to like Xerox PARC, a really early version of it called Riverbank Laboratories, and he was convinced that the Baconians were real. So he like funded, he had people just come and live there and work on these theories, because he thought it was science. Like they weren't doing it the way at Summit University. Yeah.
It's the science aspect of it
Yeah.
that I think is really interesting.
Can I-
You're right, they thought it was science, and Riverbank is fascinating for that reason. Yeah.
And it was pretty scientific.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I wanted to, one of the things, Liliana's analogy to the uncanny, it's part of what I was feeling about Gallup, because, the figure I kept thinking of was Charlton Hinman, because Gallup is staring at the material letter forms. It's exactly what Hinman is doing to figure out the composition and distribution of the first folio and the order of printing of the first folio. And, Hinman also produced a facsimile of the first folio, and his innovation in the collation device is to treat, it kind of goes the other way, because like he's treating text as image as opposed to encoding it in binary plain text or whatever, right? Like he's treating it as a static image, but that's behind the biliteral cipher that Gallup is looking at, right? It's like the image of the letter form. So it's like this, I agree, it's a kind of uncanny underside of the same techniques that are like the most established forms of bibliography. And I don't know, and Hinman also worked in the war, like as decoding aerial photography. It's part of where he gets the idea from. So I don't know if Hinman is, I don't know what Hinman's aware of in this stuff, but this is like Gallup's doing very early type analysis, right? Also reminds me of like the work on Gutenberg, and like the weird little variations in type that Paul Needham works on. So I wonder if like was Hinman aware of any of this stuff? Would be interesting just from the Shakespeare studies angle. And then I also wonder about the history of like, where is Gallup in the history of analyzing the appearance of typeface? As a key to, I mean, there are people working in the 1800s on like typeface as identifying printers.
Yeah, no, I mean, Hinman also is the guy who, of course, like figured out the facsimile was Frankenstein and all that. So, I mean, he's doing all that work. I don't know. I mean, I should do a more systematic search, because it would be curious to know if he knows this stuff. My sense is that it's not really known, because by the time you get to that kind of like 1950s moment, it's like really like Elizabeth Friedman has written the book, like, dismissing it. So like there's kind of serious cryptography has gone in this direction, serious bibliography has gone in this direction, right? And they just become these kind of earlier quacks. But yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And the decoding of the type earlier too. Absolutely uncanny.
All right. Thanks, Michael.
I was just gonna say, I mean, this reminds me of that relationship between alchemy and chemistry,
Mhm.
because alchemy may be doing all these crazy things, but it's developing techniques which are incredibly useful and become part of what's modern chemistry. So it's that funny, interesting interplay between the two, where, you know, they're totally crazy and you're trying to find the philosopher's stone and all that. But but there's this practical side to it that they're developing, which I think is reminds me of what's going on here too.
I love that analogy. Yeah, that's really smart.
Thank you, Whitney. I really enjoyed that. This may be, I'm not sure this is a good question, but I was thinking about Liliana's original question and also a few others. And it led me down two paths, which I can articulate really swiftly. The first is, when we're trying to teach students to close read, we'll often ask them to start with the simple fact that, you know, you, the student, might have noticed a pattern. And the first thing you do is, if you think you notice a pattern, is that you then look and see if the pattern is really a pattern, right? At which point you begin asking, is there a how to the pattern? And maybe is there a why to the pattern? So I've got that in one hand. On my other hand, I'm thinking that when I'm teaching poetry, one of the moments of frequent frustration is when you run into the 3 or 4 students who want to read everything allegorically. So you're presenting them with a perfectly lovely text that is really lovely to read, and they want to turn it into this other text. And I always try to, by teaching tropes, to make them prefer metaphor, where, you know, my love may be a red rose, but my love is still my love, where you get both rather than the thing allegory does, which is just turn one thing into the other. The reason I'm putting these in both hands is because I'm thinking about the fact that these people are Baconians, right?
Yeah.
And what I love about your talk is that there is apparently, and this is why Liliana is an inspiration here, there is apparently no actual relation, actual in quotation marks, I'm thinking about images, between the actual content of the plays that they're reading and the cipher. And yet there is an ideological telos that keeps getting produced. And I feel like you kind of articulated this, but I want to throw in the words allegory and maybe intentional fallacy. I don't know the right, but I want to throw those two words, lob them like grenades in the middle of our table. Are those two words useful to you, or in your talk, are there better? Are there ways that you were already talking about it that for you are better?
I mean, are you suggesting that we are all Baconians in
No,
our own perverse way? I mean, because I mean, this is, yeah, go ahead.
I'm fascinated by the fact that there's apparently no relation between the content of the plays and the end, and yet obviously there is.
And I think that's exactly the thing that the telegraph provides, because, you know, when you're, and not just the telegraph, but these mechanical typesetters and these other means of like encoding text, not just in binary, but mostly in binary, because it becomes the easiest system to, you know, early enough. Like that kind of divorce between the content of the text and the like apparent text makes possible this kind of reading of layered things, right? And I guess what I'm kind of interested in your question, and what I kind of kept coming back to when I was doing some of this research, is like, well, if we take this seriously as like a means of this is like a theory of reading that they're offering us. A lot of this theory of reading is still very, very present, not just in like skeptical reading or reading for a kind of like a reading for ideology to like peel back the layers of the text, although that's evident too, but it's just in regular close reading practices. That's what they're doing, is close reading. And so there's this kind of like, when does it tip over and when doesn't it? I mean, I think the authorship thing and the intentional fallacy is part of the answer to that question, in that like this is like perverse underbelly bibliography, because they have already the answer in their head and they're searching for it, right? Here, they know Bacon's the author, they're going to find it. In some ways, they're just overly obsessed with authorship. They're obsessed with the fact that there's not enough evidence for Shakespeare. They're obsessed with Shakespeare as an author. They're obsessed with the text as a marker of the person behind the text, right? Which is in some ways kind of the opposite of the move that you're trying to get your students, it sounds like, to kind of not do, but some students keep going back to, right? Like reading biographically and things like that. So it's, I guess, a perverse, perverse obsession with authorship that weirdly gives us a lot of methods that enable us to close read absent an author. So there's it keeps tipping back and forth in fun ways. Yeah.
So another way in which the code, another function of code besides sort of the telegraph and the secrecy, is veneration of the text itself, and so in Hebrew Bible scholarship, the use of what's called gematria is based on the quest to enrich understanding of the Hebrew Bible, to say that there's always excess meaning, but it can't just be random meaning. It's got to be things that are, enriching our understanding or solving puzzles or things like that. So gematria is, so if you look at numbers in the Hebrew Bible, they're always translations of tens and hundreds and thousands into words. But at a certain point, and I think it's fairly late in the, before the Common Era, they started assigning numerical value to the letters of the alphabet. And from then on, many things are now referred to by number instead of by names, like the days of the week and various other things. And certain combinations of numbers and letters all of a sudden take on special meaning, like 15 combines two letters that are very key to the name of God, which is not supposed to be uttered in vain. And so there's all kinds of gymnastics to get around that. So the way this proceeds is not only to find things of meaning, not only in the number value of a certain word that they pick out as a keyword, but they also look at the shapes of the letters. So for example, they look at truth and sin, and they notice that the letters that make up the word truth are grounded and stable, whereas the letters that make up the word sin are teetering. And so they make all kinds of extra meaning like that. So some of this is, I don't think that depended on technology in that sense, but it was coming out of a sense of putting the text and its lettering system and making them so sacred that there are other ways to even get more out of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know fully about that. So thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a question. Oh, Carrie, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Whitney, this was so fascinating. I feel a research black hole coming in my future. I want to ask you a short question, and this might be me engaging in further conspiratorial thinking with the Baconians, but I was wondering, I'll follow up with why I'm asking. I was wondering about the relationship between mathematics and the Baconians' cryptography and methods, and whether that was part of or influential in their own kind of approach or thinking. And the reason I ask is because I've been researching a lot on the way in which mathematics was shifting in the early to mid 19th century from a more material representational practice to more of a symbolic formal practice. Hence, we get more of a development of math representing syllogisms through Boolean logic, and a lot of the moves in algebra and formal math of trying to move away from the material restrictions of arithmetic, of numbers representing things, exact things. And I was really struck by the way in which cryptography and this bibliographic practice almost becomes this like displaced or misplaced materiality. associated with numbers that for a minute in this moment are kind of getting wayward and free of or symbols as well, needing to attach to real countable things. So yeah, the question is relationship to math. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I wish I had a much more intricate answer for you, except to say like, yes, that's all there. And you're totally right and onto something in terms of thinking about the kind of D and re and displaced materialism of numbers in the period. And actually, you're making me think tracing that a little more directly would provide a kind of firmer through line to computing, in fact, because it's Boolean logic that gives computers like the potential to be like functioning devices. Yeah, and I mean, yes, all of that's there. The mathematics in something like the Great Cryptogram, like they are definitely, they're multiplying, they're dividing, all, they're it's like this is just an example, and I could say many different types of things here, but like Donnelly might look at the third word on the third line, see what it is, and then count the words between that word and the next instance of that same word. And then he would find a pattern. It's like, oh, it's 96 words always between the word, ship or whatever. And then he'll take 96 and he'll map out how it physically lays on the page. And then he'll say, well, here's another word, and that's also 96 times. So now we found a pattern, right? So, and it's all about computing the text as this kind of like number machine. So yeah, you're totally onto something there. And I think I know you're interested in Babbage. There's like some Babbage behind this, certainly, in his thinking. I mean, he wrote about printing, he wrote about telegraphy, he was very interested in all of this stuff. His difference engine had a printer on it. He was very interested in thinking about the encoding of characters, and landed on using physical pieces of type to print out the outputs of his computer. So yeah, I mean, that's all entangled in there for sure.
Yeah, Joseph Powley.
Hi, thank you so much, Whitney. I've got so much out of this, and I wanted to ask you about how this Baconian, et cetera, practice dovetails with something else I associate with that movement that is something we trace back to, the Alexandrians with the ancient version of this, and that has to do with acrostics. So apologies if you mentioned it and I missed it, because there was a point in there where I was making dinner for my kids. But it is, for us, like with classical scholarship, acrostics are a point of tension, because we have this running disagreement about whether the primary mode of interfacing with text in Roman antiquity is with your eyes or with your ears. And we still have people making a lot of scholarly hay out of identifying increasingly ornate and multilingual acrostics in Hellenistic literature. I'm just wondering how the practices you're talking about sort of intersect with, or are they substantially different from acrostic hunting?
I mean, I didn't know that, although I'd love to know that now. That's really that's fascinating. I mean, I've actually always wondered about that with acrostics, because it's such a material practice, but oftentimes it's located in moments where we think of material text as having not having primacy. So it's interesting to know that that's a debate in the field. Yeah, acrostics show up here, although they very quickly get vaporized into these like number calculations and things like that. Like literal acrostics of like spelling out Francis Bacon never shows up, because it doesn't occur in the text. Like they're trying to find a way to make it show up in the text, but it doesn't. It'll be like page acrostics. So Donnelly does a lot with the form. So it'll be like, if you look at the top left corner in this spot of every page, and then you take every letter there, then you can spell something like that kind of work that's very rooted in the visual page. They're all super rooted in the visual, and not, I would say, in the like auditory at all, which is kind of interesting for me with Morse. Morse ends up being like, he's kind of an interesting crossover figure that kind of cross-pollinates these two worlds. But I'm not fully, in terms of thinking about what to do with this work, sure how to place him, because I don't think he's ultimately interested at all in Baconianism, although there is all kinds of weird, I mean, a lot of people in the 19th century were into this. Mark Twain was obsessed with it. Like a lot of people were very into the Baconian controversy. But his Morse key very quickly becomes a sounded device. So da 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 da, right? Like dots and dashes, which kind of veers away from the perforated paper tapes that are so important for a lot of what I've been thinking about in the period in terms of binary encoding of text and material means. So that's not an answer to your question so much, although to say that I really enjoy now that knowledge and I would love to know more about it. But there is, this is very much a materialist practice, and there's not a whole lot of sound
There's
or
an
the auditory. Yeah.
There's an ancient Greek parallel to what's going on with gematria, because in
Right.
ancient Greek, the letters are also the numbers are also the letters are also numbers. There's even an ancient Greek word for when you take two lines of Homer, when you can find two lines of Homer where the numerical values of the letters have the same sum. And the reason we know about this practice is because there's a sort of running argument over whether this constitutes the kind of like literacy a learned gentleman should have, or is this the kind of weird technical knowledge of language that only like secretaries and school teachers should have? I think that's close to what you're talking about as well.
When is that happening? Like, is that because if we're talking about like a memorizing practice, like memorized poetry, you're talking about written.
Yeah, this is something that comes out of the Alexandrian moment that is the full textualization of those oral traditions. And that's where you get people saying, okay, I'm going to write hexameter just like Homer, but it's going to be full of all these like visual clues and all this like weird stuff that would only really happen for people who are using pens and pages.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Marco, I was just thinking that the most eminent scholar in modern linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure, wrote about this kind of consistency and code within classical poetry. Paragrams, I think he used to call them, like, and he is beyond suspicion. I mean, he's not a quack for sure, but still he was fascinated by this sort of you can call it conspiracy in seeing hidden meaning in classical poetry, the way it was presented in critical editions. So, but in a non historically plausible material vest. It was just like I was thinking about this the whole time.
Yeah. Oh,
This-
fascinating.
I just think Gallup is so interesting. There's something about the history of typography there too. I didn't know about that second part of Bacon's cipher, where it really depends on letter form. But she's paying attention to the stuff that you're not supposed to read. And that typography is trying right through the late 19th, early 20th century to like clear away. Like, so you're not supposed to worry, other than like italic or whatever. You're not supposed to worry about like serif or sans serif font, and like that's what she's reading. So it's sort of like the acrostic thing made me think of it, because it's like another way of reading the material text that's not what you're supposed to read. That's like not the content of the text, right? I would just wonder who's doing, like, what are typographers talking about at this point? Like, who's paying attention to that?
Some of I don't remember who exactly it is, but one of her kind of followers, we have one of the books on the table. It's very beautiful kind of book that has very beautiful delicate tracings of the different letter forms, like in this kind of typographic like type appreciation way. I always just think like, and I see this with students sometimes when you give them a photograph of an early modern printing or bring them here and show them a book, they're always obsessed with the long S, right? Like there's certain things that they just latch onto as super weird, and it's because they're bringing to it all these assumptions. And I can't help but think that they, someone like Gallup is turning her kind of gut reaction of, oh, this is strange, into like a full-blown theory.
Almost a kind of arts and craftsian zone there too, of getting re-obsessed with things that are. I love this too. Thank you. It's great that you found that letter our Mr. Furness.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, can you say a little more about getting at some of the picture of the sort of concentric circles here, but so our Baconians,
Mhm.
what about the Oxfordians? Is this, I don't, you know, are they part of this? I don't know anything about them. And then there's the editors,
Mhm.
the Furness, and I guess the fourth concentric circle is like the collectors. Did some of these people, I mean, you mentioned the problems, it sounds like some of them knew about the facsimile.
Yeah.
And so are a lot of them trying to, let me go meet Mr. Folger so I can see his actual books because
Yeah.
that will solve it.
Elizabeth Wells Gallup she's very like,
I mean, there's the Columbia thing you talked about, yeah.
yeah, I mean, famously, like the story of Elizabeth Friedman coming to work with Elizabeth Wells Gallup at Riverbank Laboratories is this eccentric millionaire, billionaire, whatever, George Fabian was at the Newberry and saw this young woman looking at like the first folio, and he was like, "Oh, are you interested in that?" And she was like, "Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing with my life." And he was like, "Come back to Riverbank Laboratories and, you know, decipher these codes." And she got super into it and had a
We should
knack
start
for it.
that up again.
Yeah. So, you know, he was he was involved in and around the Newberry, and they were getting, because Riverbank is outside of Chicago, so they were getting photographs from the Newberry, and he sent her over to England to get stuff. So there's kind of like but in terms of your question around like the overlap, I mean, Furness is getting all this stuff all the time, as you know, right? And I think Owen was just like send it to everybody, you know, promote my materials. There's copies of his books, you know, sent out. And as far as I know, it's just like, he's like, no, it's not interested at all. Right. But in terms of its popularity, it was a hugely popular theory in the late 19th century. I mean, probably more popular than the idea that Shakespeare authored his works, right?
Yeah.
And Oxfordianism comes like a little bit later, I
Okay.
think, and then becomes really big in the 1960s. And it's still, I mean, I'm sure you get emails from these people.
Yeah, not about Bacon so much, but now I get a lot of
yeah.
emails about Henry Neville. Who's
Okay.
another
Yes.
politician figure.
I mean,
like Bacon.
and the other question is that I'm surprised Zach didn't ask, so I'll ask it, is, what about the Quarto problem? As opposed to what do they do with the, like, there's more than one text for a Shakespeare play thing?
Oh, well, they're all, I mean, like Elizabeth Wells Gallup looks at every major printed book, like anything that you could teach in an early modern literature course, she's looking at. So she's looking at the quartos, she's looking at the folios, she's got like different folders for all of it.
Somewhere in those 28 boxes.
Yeah. And she's very, you know, but the first folio has this kind of, you know, cultural cachet that they really latch onto. And it's the one that's in facsimile, circulating in facsimile very early on. So there's this kind of amateur bibliographers can kind of be doing this work with it, and so it kind of really gains steam around that. But she's looking at everything, and she really thinks basically Bacon authored like all of English literature. And I mean, nobody's asked this, but like, why is also an open question. I mean, there's all kinds of like theories that, you know, Bacon was the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth and all this kind of stuff, and so he had to hide his real thoughts about things. And but the extent that they imagine him going to encode this thing, I mean, it wouldn't have happened in an early modern print shop. It's fascinating to me to think that, like, if they are bibliographers coming up with a theory of like what that process looks like, it's like such a bizarre process where the author's in there kind of helping set the types, and there's different type cases, and it's a code, and it's very carefully tracked.
Yeah, what are they looking at in the printing processes of their own time that could have made them even imagine
That's a good question.
that such a thing could have ever been like that? That's weird.
Yeah.
Did they ever entertain why?
Why Bacon?
Yeah, or why Bacon would do it?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's the thing I'm just.
I mean, all kinds of stuff. They think that he was like under threat because of this thing with Queen Elizabeth as his illegitimate mother. It's gonna hurt her. Yeah, I mean, for Delia Bacon, it was Republican philosophy. He was a Republican and anti-monarchist, and so he's, you know, encoding this secret philosophy in these texts. And
Last question, for other people who also know the code? Or is it just doing it?
Right.
No one will ever find it.
That
No.
wrote it.
A letter in the bottle, yeah, to the future, so that people finally will know that he really wrote it. And the flip side of it is that Shakespeare's a fraud, right? This guy who we venerated, who was like the Bible for the 19th century in England, like he's a complete fraud. He doesn't exist. He's a country
Such a liar.
bumpkin, such a liar. He didn't, yeah, exactly. So, and which is part of like, I mean, there's a lot of elitism, classism to this whole movement as well. Like Shakespeare's like like some people, it seems like they literally can't compute that Shakespeare was could possibly, given what we know of his education, have written the plays. So
So it's thank you.
it makes me just, as a last word, I guess, it one of the things I love about researching this stuff and all these weirdos, like it really does make you wonder what we're doing and what we think that is just 150 years from now, people are going to be like, and they thought that,
On that.
That- All right, thank you very much.